Thank you, Bill. I want to thank Bill for all the work that he's done and that the council have done to put this together, and say what a great privilege it is to be here, and in particular to be here in company with such a distinguished panel, which includes friends, colleagues, mentors, former bosses. So I'd like to use the very good example that Gabs has provided to start out with a couple of questions, and then quickly throw it open to questions from you all, because I think that that's really, in terms of the purpose of this conference, of thinking about what's next. I think your questions are probably what's going to help us really hone that vision. But I would start out by saying that we've seen 5 years of really extraordinary progress in the security and diplomatic relationship. I think one of the real challenges that we face in some ways is that we've made so much progress, that we've done it so much more rapidly than some people had thought would be possible. And so that actually forces us to start thinking about where we're going to go and what this means. I mean, the phrase that on the U.S. side we use is a new normal. And so I guess what I'd like to start off by doing is asking the panelists to talk about what does the new normal mean, and for the New Zealanders, what is New Zealand looking for from the United States as part of the new normal? And then for the Americans, what is the United States looking for from New Zealand as part of the new normal? So with that, I think I would ask Carolyn, who can follow a little bit also on the outstanding remarks from Alan on border security and how that impacts our broader interests. But if you'd start off and give us some of your thoughts about what does a new normal mean?
So I'd reflect very strongly the same comments, essentially, that Alan has made in his briefing. The flow of legitimate trade and legitimate travel activity is something that we want to continue to facilitate, and that security and the understanding of it within the organisations, particularly customs organisations, it's essentially the other side of the coin. And so we can never lower our guard around the security and protection elements. But actually the facilitation of legitimate trade is critically important for New Zealand, as indeed it is for all economies, particularly in the GFC post-period. When we look at what that actually means, it does mean the kinds of things Alan was talking about, which are having better intelligence, sharing that intelligence, taking a risk assessment approach to the work that we do. We work very closely, as Alan indicated, with the CBP here, and we enjoy a strong working relationship through the World Customs Organisation with a range of other customs jurisdictions. And collectively, what we are all trying to do is reduce the hay in the haystack and get down to a point where the needles are easier to find. In the New Zealand context, that inevitably means trying to stop transnational crime, particularly with drugs, and we've had a particular problem over recent years with methamphetamine production in our society. It's caused tremendous harm to our society, and limiting precursors coming into New Zealand. We leverage the international agencies, DEA, ICE, that work particularly well in this area, and it's our relationships with the US that actually give us some of that insight and intelligence. So we see the relationship with the US going forward as being very strong. We do a lot with Australia, which obviously is our closest neighbour, and with quite free trade between New Zealand and Australia. We also have to have a strong working relationship with Australia. But between Australia and ourselves, the US environment and many of the things Alan talked about are also reciprocated in Australia. So we've got a very close working relationship in the customs context. Probably said enough at this point. Perhaps hand over to you, Rhys.
Lieutenant General, it's a great privilege and pleasure to have you here. And I think as particularly based on the very close cooperation that we've had in Afghanistan, I'm curious what your thoughts are about where do we go in the coming years and what does the new normal mean?
The start point is that this hasn't been a sudden change in the military environment. We've been working together as two countries for the last few decades, even during the peak periods where there was that isolation of New Zealand. And so those links have always been there when there's been the operational need. Where there has been a rapid increase, though, is over the last perhaps 10 to 5 year period, closing up to here, particularly out of Afghanistan. But also, let's admit it, the working with Australia in our own region and the Australian lobbying with the Americans to work through. We've maintained our linkages for standardisation with the American, Canadian, Australian, UK forces, and that's allowed us to, I suppose, get on the merry-go-round at speed at a reasonably good pace. The big issue for us, though, is, okay, what do we want out of this new relationship, and what does the US require from us on here? What we need is, like the other superpower US, New Zealand is also reorienting back into our Pacific region. We've got a military that's probably more suited to the highland mountains of Afghanistan than it is back into the tropics or the Polynesian, Melanesian, Indo-Malay cultures in the region. So we also need to come back into our own zones for our own benefits. That's a largely ocean zone, and so we need to actually gain skills to be able to reoperate back in those areas. Amphibious capability is top of the list. Who are the big experts of amphibious capabilities in the world? That's the US. So we have a technical, tactical need to work with US forces to gain our proficiency in our own region. But as we've all been discussing, the Southwest Pacific's not really the dominant future economically. It's Southeast Asia, it's North Asia, it's other parts of the world. And so the New Zealand military is always going to be employed somewhere else in the world. And therefore our ability to operate with other militaries, particularly to standardise our approaches with those militaries or those countries that are going to lead, is quite crucial to us. And the reverse side of that is what the US wants out of us is to have a world-class capability that can go and contribute. The difference that they're expecting of us is they don't just want another flag on the desk. They can get that from any other country. The US actually requires from us a country that can compete, that, to use a colloquial term, when we all get in the swimming pool, we're not just floating. We can actually participate in the event as it goes out. So there's that balance. And the dilemma for us is how much we need to be able to handle all the situations in our own region. So I need to build a Meccano set that can handle all crises in the Southwest Pacific region. They're going to be low security threat, more human security issues and new security rather than traditional conflict. But I need everything to be able to do that. The problem is, therefore, how do I then take something out of that? How do I unbolt bits of that Meccano set and actually keep it world-class capable so they can contribute to a UN-led, a US-led, an Australian-led, a Canadian or a British-led or Singaporean-led operation somewhere else where that combat threshold is a lot higher. And that's really the big dilemmas and the balance that we as a country need to be able to sort out and say, where does our defence policy fit in to foreign policy? And I'll close on a line that I've often used, which is not entirely true, but it sums up our approach. We don't have a defence policy. We have a foreign policy that defence supports. Because we are probably arguably the safest country, we are there, the military are there to support our foreign policy goals.
Thank you very much, General. John, I think it's something that goes to you on the foreign policy.
Thanks very much, and can I say how delighted I am that we have the support of the Defence Force in executing New Zealand's foreign policy. I suppose the key thing for me in terms of the new normal is nothing's off the table. So whereas there were some lines, there were some barriers, there were some conversations that couldn't be had, those conversations now can be had. Of course, that's hugely challenging for New Zealand because we've now got to turn up with some good thinking, some real ideas. As Rhys said, when you plunge into the pool, you've got to be careful because it's quite deep. There's a hell of a lot of water in it, and if we're not very careful, we will drown. So for New Zealand, we have to turn up with some really good thinking. So for me, it's three things that we want from the relationship. The first is access. So when we turn up with our good thinking, we want the access to be able to present it. We want the understanding that New Zealand is a country that comes up with good ideas and can add value. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we want collaboration. I mean, the reality is no one country can solve all the problems in front of us, but frankly, the US is central to solving many of those problems with partners. So for New Zealand, it's the collaborative opportunities, whether it's in the Antarctic with the marine protected area, whether it's in Afghanistan, wherever it might be, we want to collaborate. And then the third thing for me is commitment. We want to know, and I think on the basis of our working with the US we know this, but nonetheless we want to know that when the US says it is committed, it is, and it is turning up. That has been our experience to date, but I think that is very important as we move forward.
Thank you.
Well, let me say that I sincerely hope that defense in the United States also supports our foreign policy. Look, three quick points on the new normal. First, there is definitely a new normal. The Wellington Declaration on the foreign affairs side, followed by the Washington Declaration on the defense side, gave us a different kind of foundation. And it's something that people sometimes miss, because the fact is, at least when you look at the war fighting piece of it, we've fought together in every conflict for the last century, basically. There has been no gap in what we do together. But there has been a gap in thinking about things, wrestling with hard issues together, and the new normal has set that up. So for example, to that end, for the first time in a long while, we will have formal defense policy talks and formal military staff talks this fall. So that's really actually a big deal. It means our leaders are getting together and our senior officials are getting together and our senior military leaders are getting together to actually talk about how they see the world and what they think should be done and how we're strategically approaching things, rather than just getting together to cooperate on actually operationally doing something, right? Which is also obviously hugely important and something we are deeply grateful to New Zealand for always being there for the United States. But that's one, so it is a new normal. And the second thing is that new normal, by giving us a foundation, in a way we've done the easy part. So the easy part is you've set up this foundation and we have some things that we know we're going to work on together. In the security realm, we're going to work on New Zealand's ability to operate and be a force of stability in its immediate area in the South Pacific. We're going to work on countries' abilities to contribute to peacekeeping operations. We're going to work on humanitarian assistance, disaster response, things like that. But the third point, and I think the most important thing, is that the hard part is yet to come, because the hard part is going to be what about when we don't see quite eye to eye? Or what about issues that we think where we might actually have the same goals but different approaches to things? And I think we're going to see a lot of that when it comes to some of the inherent tensions that are manifest in the region. That's with regard to the rise of China and globalization, changes in trade patterns. There are a whole host of issues where you could see these being sources of tension, and before we could ignore them because we didn't have those conversations as much as we really should. Now we can't ignore them, and at their best, what they'll do is they'll help us on each side think through them better and work collaboratively towards our most common aims. But it won't be without tension, so we need to be willing to push each other and take this new normal and really turn it into something very proactive.
Thank you. Randy?
Great. Well, before answering, let me just take a moment to thank the organizers of this partnership forum. I'm one who has attended each one of these since its start, and just continues to be, I think, the premier forum of its kind, and has really, I think, made a contribution to the relationship at the official level. Having stated that, being at every one of these forums means that I was part of the old normal, and I think for many of our American friends, I think our Kiwi friends are probably a little bit more in touch with what the old normal was really about. A lot of American friends may not appreciate the progress that has been made. I remember when I was serving as a Deputy Assistant Secretary, in the same month I escorted a PLA senior officer on the base in Hawaii at PACOM, whizzed through with full honors and equal treatment as any treaty ally would get, and received by the head of Pacific Command. And in that same month, I tried to take a New Zealand diplomat, who I'm sure many of you know, Tony Brown, and had to get the Deputy Secretary of Defense to approve even his entry onto the base. And something was wrong there. Something was seriously wrong. So before talking about the new normal, I think we have to appreciate just how much progress has been made. The new normal, I think it was George Shultz who talked about alliance management and relationship management as being analogous to gardening, that it's not always every meeting is going to produce a concrete deliverable or some big splashy news item. That, like gardening, you've got to add water, you've got to pull weeds, you've got to do the seasonal planting, and what you really want is an alliance that is there when you need it for problems big and small. And by the way, I do use the A word. I know we should be careful on the defense panel to use the A word, but to me it's inconceivable that we wouldn't act as allies in the event one of us were really in need and would need the other. So I do use that expression. But we're in this stage now where I think we are part of that gardening. There's still some work to be done to achieve a completely normal alliance-like relationship, but now we're in a process of trying to manage the relationship so that it's there when we need it for problems big and small. And there are plenty of them, but I think ultimately in the United States we will take measure of the value of the relationship when it comes to the biggest challenges, and these have been already put on the table. But I think it's important for Americans to remember what Minister Macaulay said yesterday. There are things the United States can do that New Zealand and maybe other countries cannot. There are things New Zealand can do that the United States cannot. And so when we look at challenges in the global commons, cyber and others, that's an all-hands-on-deck exercise, as we say in the Navy. But when we look at managing a relationship like China, there are certainly things New Zealand can do that we can't do. The quality of that relationship is just different, and the level of trust is just different. And so I think we'll talk about China a little bit more on the panel, but we need to think about not only collaboration, which I think will always be the sort of center of the relationship and the foundation, but also division of labor, which is a kind of collaboration, and to think about how we can manage the regional challenges in a smart way.
Great. Stanley?
Well, I'm at a point on the panel where I think the key points have been made, so let me just say a couple things to let you move on to the next question. First, I want to pick up what Randy said about the old normal, because most of my career in government in the 1990s was under the old normal and the unfinished business that dominated the relationship. You couldn't talk about a strategic partnership then. You really would have to talk about an unstrategic relationship. I wouldn't have dignified it with partnership, even though we were doing a lot of things together, including on peacekeeping, but it was a very awkward period. But the point I want to make is that there are a lot of people in this room, with the lights I can't see, is former Prime Minister Bolger here today?
Yeah.
But who really had a leading role in starting the process of recovery from a very low point. It's hard to imagine now, because things are so much better, particularly with these two declarations, that just to get a meeting with the Prime Minister and President Clinton went all the way up to the National Security Advisor of the United States, and then finally had to be resolved by President Clinton just for a meeting, much less coming to the U.S. and all the steps that followed. But people in multiple governments in both sides of the Pacific had to work to get us to where we are today, and it's a much better situation in terms of the national interests of both countries. Now, in terms of the new normal, I agree with everything that's been said, so let me just try to focus on one dimension, which is the strategic dialogue, which is being regularized. And the point that I would like to make is we need to pick up, I think, on some of the points the General made, and I'll use an unkind word that he didn't, but we can't trivialize it. We can't only have it on the soft dimensions of defense, things that need to be done and are good and wholesome and right, but that aren't the core security issues. If we're ultimately going to have, and I think we are, a serious security and defense relationship, we have to be prepared to consult, discuss, analyze, and sometimes act on the core issues. And one of the striking things to me is that even as we talk about 21st century issues, right now, when you look around the world, a lot of very traditional 19th and 20th century geopolitical issues are on the front of the agenda. And so I hope that the strategic dialogue at all the levels that have been mentioned are going to be talking about Iran, where something may happen this year and we may need to act together, that are going to be talking about North Korea, East China Sea, very tense situation, number one on my worry list, South China Sea, up there, all the issues, and not instead of climate change and humanitarian and disaster relief and all the other issues, but that we never veer from the core security issues that are ultimately going to define a defense relationship.
Thank you. I think that's very, very wise, and it's something that's useful for us to keep in context, because I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the things that the U.S.-New Zealand relationship has historically been able to do are things that are quite hard. And in that context, I'd throw it to the panel. We've had, and Randy specifically mentioned it, and that is China. I mean, what are the challenges that China poses for our diplomacy and for the region, and how are we doing in terms of working together on China? Maybe I could start with John.
Well, the first thing that I'd say is think of the opportunity. I mean, there are challenges, and I'll talk a little about challenges in a moment, but I mean, the lens through which I think we most need to think about China are the opportunities that the successful modernization and rise of China present for all of us. And I don't just mean in the trade context. I mean in having a dynamic and successful China in the international architecture, wherever, in all areas of it. And for me, I see significant opportunities for all of us as a consequence of that. So I am optimistic about the success of China, and I'm positive about the contribution that China can, and I believe will make, on the international stage. Are there challenges? Yes, there are. We all know about them. I mean, some of the hotspot issues of the moment that deal to some of the territorial tensions that Chinese friends are wrestling with others, some of the wider geopolitical issues, some of the environmental issues, some of the demographic issues. There are a whole range of issues that sit out there, and you can plot those and you can develop scenarios about how China's going to travel over the next period. My own view is that the most likely scenario is that, with a certain number of bumps and lumps and undoubtedly some difficulty along the way, China will continue on a trajectory of growth and of success. And as I've said, that represents significant opportunities for us all. In terms of how we are working together on China, this goes a little bit to the point that was made before. Is it possible for us to disagree between New Zealand and the United States? Is it possible for us to have different perspectives and to share those perspectives constructively? Well, what I can tell you is that in the current environment, it is absolutely possible for those conversations to occur. They are occurring. That is absolutely the new normal. And what we have found is there is a real richness in that conversation, which certainly benefits New Zealand, but I hope that some of the perspectives that New Zealand's able to bring to that conversation are also beneficial to our US friends.
Stanley, to make sure you're not we don't go around the same way. Why don't you see if you have anything you want to say?
Well, I certainly agree with the perspective that we can't lose track of the opportunities, and coming at a hopeful moment one day after we've announced a two-day summit between the senior leadership in our country is very significant, rather than waiting till the end of the year, and not just a one-hour meeting on the margins of an international meeting, but clearly a very substantive, not only getting to know each other session, but how can we work together session. The opportunities loom large. At the same time, we can't avoid the challenges, and I think what both our countries have to keep in mind, and many other countries as well, is kind of a perversion of the Carvel saying, it's not just the economy, stupid. You know, as more and more the Asia-Pacific region moves to a situation where China is the largest trading partner, and increasingly China becoming a very large investment partner, although it has a lot of catching up to do in terms of the West. But China is going to have major economic issues and major clout in a number of countries in the region, and that's not inherently bad or worrisome. It's pretty normal and follows our own pattern of development over, the last century or so. The question is what they do with it, and also how the countries on the other side, how they react to it. I think the point is, and your foreign minister made it yesterday, is that even as economic interests increase and argue for interaction with China, at the same time, traditional strategic and geopolitical interests remain, and New Zealand and other countries, certainly Australia, have to remain cognizant of those as well. And I think things like the strategic dialogue that we've been talking about are going to help to manage that. So challenges plenty, but opportunities to meet them, I think so.
Carolyn?
Yeah, I'd see tremendous opportunities for New Zealand out of China as well. I think what we find within our customs context is actually it's a different kind of environment. to work in. We're forging quite strong relationships. We do some exchanges with some of our counterparts, have them spend a few months working with our people, and equally have our people go and visit them as well. I think in the Chinese context, there's an expectation that government and business will work together, and that's not necessarily the model that applies in other jurisdictions. And so the ability for the customs organisations to work closely with business to ensure facilitation across the border. So John's area is working very much on getting the market access right, and our trade and enterprise people very much in the distribution. But there's still a piece that's about facilitation at the border in China, and I think the closer we can work with business to affect that, it is a different model. It's a different model to how we would normally see business trading. I think the challenge that I look at, because China is, New Zealand's great opportunity, but it's actually partially my nightmare too, because we were talking about nightmares and hallucinations earlier this morning, but the nightmare kind of side of it is the sheer size and scale. And we're a relatively small country at the, as my minister would sometimes describe New Zealand, the last bus stop on the way to the Antarctica. So you kind of look at it and you think to yourself, well, there's tremendous opportunity here, but actually we don't have perhaps some of the same confidence levels around information sharing. And as we talked about earlier, one of the things that Customs needs to fulfil its security protection role, the other side of the trade facilitation coin, it's very much around having confidence that we can identify the needles, that we can strip away the hay and make sure that we're allocating our resource to the right things. It's not an impossible kind of situation, because, as I indicated earlier, we had quite an issue in New Zealand around precursors for methamphetamine. We've actually had really good response from our colleagues in China that's related over the years we've been working with them to constructive joint operations. We've shared information through the World Customs Organization operations as well. In fact, China has initiated one of those global operations. We also see that the information quality, where we have a good indication of understanding, that we do establish enough trust to do it. So it's a huge opportunity, but actually the sheer size and scale, the growth that is predicted, even for facilitation of legitimate travel into New Zealand, perhaps going from 200,000 visitors to New Zealand to 1 million over a relatively short period of time our Prime Minister's talking about. I mean, SmartGate at the moment, which is our automated border process for legitimate travellers, doesn't accept anything more than New Zealand-Australian electronic passports. We're actually working on a pilot for UK and US passports, electronic passports, but not China. So, you know, we've got challenges there about how do we actually manage in an environment where perhaps we don't have the same level of confidence.
Randy.
Yeah, if I were to describe a country and tell you that this country, their most important economic partner, as far as the eye can see, is China, their most important security partner in terms of fundamental guarantees of peace and security, experiences the tyranny of geography. China is close, big, hereby, the United States, tyranny of time and distance, somewhat uncomfortable with choosing, being forced to choose by the two powers. What country am I describing? I'm describing Japan, I'm describing South Korea, I'm describing Australia. So this notion that we may see things differently is a notion that we're dealing with all our treaty allies, with all our friends in the region. To me, the challenge is, can we agree on an assessment of the trajectory of China and what the opportunities and challenges are, even if we fundamentally might sort of lay in different spots on the spectrum of where those opportunities are or where the challenges are. And you know, I look at China and I see them moving Rook, Bishop, and Knight all at the same time here. It's not just the East China Sea, it's the South China Sea, it's the Indian border. And when you think about the drivers to that, you know, it can make you a little bit pessimistic. And so, because I think the drivers aren't, you know, a fundamental assessment of interests and trade-offs in terms of the regional dynamics. A lot of them are internal, a lot of manifestation of their anxiety and nervousness. And so that's a different kind of challenge to manage. So I'm of the view that we can come to it from slightly different perspectives, because we have to do that with all our allies and friends in the region. But we do need to think smartly about the trajectory that China is on and how we can have, as I said earlier, sort of a division of labor, if that's what makes the most sense. But we've got to deal with this behavior, and we've got to deal with trying to establish the best kind of future that accommodates China's rise or emergence, which is likely inevitable.
General?
I'd just like to pick up on the last point you made. That's the theme I want to take. If I can paint an analogy about perhaps the next 50 years, perhaps even 100 years, it's almost like, well, let's take the America's Cup film clips here, a yacht trying to tack upwind. We're currently on a course, we've currently got our mechanisms in place to suit the way in which the world is balanced at the moment. All our government regulations, international regulations, are like the sheets, that is the ropes for us non-sailors, that tie the sails together. There's the power that actually drives it, and we're in control of that particular environment. As we're about to tack, if you can imagine what happens when a boat tacks, you come into the wind, you lose power, you lose momentum, the power or the wind goes out of the sail, the boom comes around, and if you're not watching, it can clock you on the head, tip you overboard, and everyone's got to race around scrambling to actually get the sail set for the new one, the ropes tight, the new direction in place. But for that transition period, there is that lack of control, there is that uncertainty about what's going on. The core things that actually keeps intact are communications between all the crew members, clear understanding of actually what's going to go on, but an understanding also of we may not know exactly what setting we go on, but rapid adjustment once we're on that setting, and so readjusting to all those international rules. So the core bit to pick up here is it's with China that we actually have to understand and work to get what is the new norm for the next phase in international relations, particularly in this particular region. It's not necessarily getting China to conform with the current rules, but because they are going to be economically, demographically, politically powerful, let's start getting them around the table. And this is the core issue that the challenge for the next 5 years is actually giving them the comfort to come and express their concerns openly, because they haven't had that experience, or as much as our countries have, of being in the international fora and trusting the countries that they're talking with. They want to be treated as equals. They actually want to, their key concerns are the economic growth so they can take care of their people. They want to make sure that that's being preserved, not being forced into it. They want to take their place in the sun. So where's New Zealand's role in that? As a small country, we're not going to be the power broker that sits in between, but we've got a part to play. Encouraging China to come into those forums, being honest and open with them, acknowledging their issues and trying to work along with other countries to do that. Small things that we as in the security sector can do is have the joint things, meetings or in my case exercises where both China and other countries, including the US, can participate as well, so that level of trust can be built up. So that's the phase we're in, trust building, starting to move the international environment somewhere else to where it's going to be. But it's a tricky period, and communications is important. So travelling to China, them coming to us, having those joint sessions around here is vitally important, so that I can talk to my equivalent, the US chairman of the Joint Staff, can talk to his equivalent and find out where those, what is actually going on, and they can talk with trust.
Great, thank you, General. And before asking Vikram to comment, I'd just like to ask people to get questions ready, because after this we'll throw it open to you all and start thinking about the future. Vikram?
Well, obviously you could have a whole session just on this one question. I think the key points have been brought up already by my fellow panelists. Look, there's lots of reasons for optimism. This is not the growth of China has been good on balance for everyone, not least the United States. And our engagement with the Chinese is very deep and robust. I mean, much more so than it is with virtually any other country. So when I have countries in the region tell me, you've got to work closely with China, I have to always say, well, my Secretary of Defense just spoke to his counterpart, and the chairman was just there, and oh, by the way, we're having, our leaders are getting, we're constantly engaged. So there's a lot of hand-wringing and worry that I actually think is distracting from the core issue. And I think, General, I think you pointed to the core issue of whether the sort of largely accepted international standards and norms of behavior that have helped the Asia-Pacific move in this positive direction, whether the expectation is, China, as you step up and increase in your power, please join in this set of rules and norms of behavior, or whether it is, as you were suggesting, and there'll be adjustments made to accommodate things that change because of your weight and power. And I think those are two different strands and potentially two different directions. And I think there will be a lot of concern, not just from us, but from the countries in the region about what changes might imply. And on the positive side of the ledger, look at the increases in cooperation. We hope to see that trajectory keep going. The ASEAN countries actually being able to host exercises in Brunei this summer that involve all 10 ASEANs plus all the plus countries, us and China sending ships. I like to point out we're going to actually have 3 officers on China's new hospital ship, which is called the Peace Ark. The incoming commander of the USS Mercy, which is well known in the region for its responses to humanitarian catastrophes, will actually spend time with her counterpart on that ship during this exercise. So there's lots of things that are positive. We're doing a lot together. But the Chinese are also being very assertive on sovereignty disputes, not saying, let's leave these things, sort of aside and work on them steadily through diplomatic channels, but saying, yes, we'll do that, but also we're going to make clear where our red lines are, and we're going to push the envelope a bit, and they're doing so in ways that are extraordinarily worrying to countries in the region. They're building capabilities, and the region is asking, what are you going to do with these capabilities? Partner with us in supporting existing norms, or do something different? So I think it is a very challenging. I think it's a very challenging period, and absolutely engagement and communication is the foundation for managing the kind of shifting dynamics that we see.
Thank you, John.
Can I make just one very quick comment? I think that the idea that the systems and architecture won't change as China grows and becomes more assertive in its own, more confident on the world stage is wrong. So I don't think that we're going to see China joining the current sort of settings and simply those settings remaining the same. I think what we're going to see is an evolution of those settings to adapt them as China participates more actively. So that's a positive in my view, but I agree that it will create some nervousness in some places as the process is undertaken.
So the issue is stable change.
Good. So, as the General just said to me, so the issue is stable change.
That's a good catchphrase.
That's a magnificent new phrase from this forum.
Stable change.
Yeah.
Well, in the context of stable change, maybe we can ask some questions from the audience.
Oh, there's some.
Why don't you go first? Yeah.
Kia ora, I'm David Turner. I'm one of the future partners. My question, Mr. Schreiber used a metaphor earlier, one of quite a few metaphors we've now heard, including yachts and swimming pools and floating. The one that I liked was about the building, likening the New Zealand-US relationship to a garden.
I stole that, by the way. So.
Right, well, I like the
Recycled.
My question is, well, if that is true, which I'm sure it is, what are some of the thorns that we need to look out for? What are some of the challenges that still face the NZ-US relationship, or areas that we still need to work on?
It's a great question. Thank you very much. I think there's actually quite a few. I'd throw it maybe to Vikram, if you want to start out on some of the possible thorns from the American perspective, and then John, and then maybe Randy, who can be a reality check from the outside, and Stanley as well.
right, well, I'll be very quick and to the point and very obvious. I mean, the new normal is not completely normal. So one of the thorns is that we still have a gap on the nuclear issue. It's out there. What we've done is we decided not to let it be this obstacle to working together. But you know, it's still around, and it will just be a fact of life. What we are getting much more, I would argue, much more mature than we were in the old normal about saying we can accept differences in this kind of an area and figure out exactly how we can work very closely together and work and collaborate together on a whole host of issues. But that will still remain a difference, and differences can become thorns. Other than other than that, and some of the sensitivities that might arise, or some of the criticisms we might get in the defense sphere, I think there are going to be very few thorns if we all work together in managing the changes in the region collaboratively and effectively. I think the thorns that could come up, sort of unexpected things in your garden, pests and things like that, would come in the form of unexpected situations where tensions spill over into crisis, and how those crises are dealt with is a matter of debate and discussion. And I think we are seeing plenty of those sorts of flashpoints, and we'll continue to see those sorts of flashpoints in the region certainly in the next decade.
But I think we have to be really clear that debate and discussion and difference is not thorns. Debate and discussion and difference is actually the sign of a robust plant, a mature plant, just to maintain the analogy just for a moment. So, I mean, my own view is I don't see a hell of a lot of thorns. I mean, I really don't. I'm not out there seeing a thicket of thorns in front of us, huge problems that we have to sort of manage delicately through. I mean, we are having really detailed, really direct conversations. We are doing a lot of collaborative stuff around the world in a way that we weren't previously. We have opportunities to do a lot more. So for me, the real risks to New Zealand, or for New Zealand, are that we simply don't take advantage of the opportunities that are presented by the new normal, that we don't step up with the sort of ideas and thinking, that we're not actually adding value in a way that actually makes a difference to our US friends, and that as a consequence, we stall the momentum that's been built over the next period. So that's the big challenge in my mind.
Well, in the Rumsfeldian lexicon, there's known knowns, known unknowns, and I think these have been talked about. But let me just add one other thing from an American perspective. We've got a terrible habit of taking friends and allies for granted and not giving sufficient attention. So it's not so much thorns, to continue the analogy, it's walking away from the garden and expecting fruit when you're not doing the necessary work. And New Zealand shouldn't feel alone. Japan worries about Japan passing. We had a Secretary of State in the Bush administration, which I served in, who missed 2 ASEAN regional forums. So we have a horrible habit. So I think for the Americans, it's really important that we continue to invest even when we don't have a crisis du jour sort of driving things. And the efforts of my friends on the panel here notwithstanding, we are pivoting to Asia at a time when we don't have an Assistant Secretary of State for Asia. We don't have an Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia. For the first time in 20 years that I've been in Washington, we don't have an identifiable go-to person at the cabinet level or even the deputy level on Asia. We have questions about our defense budget sequestration. So this is not meant to be partisan at all, but it's meant as sort of a cautionary note. We've got to keep our eye on the ball and focus on this region, and we got to continue to invest, even when we don't see sort of the immediate payoff with a country like New Zealand that can contribute a great deal to us when we do get into a point of crisis or real need. But it's not easy. It's not easy. It takes people at this level really driving their leadership to stay focused and stay engaged. And so far, so good. But one Middle East crisis away or one other problem away from a serious diversion of attention, and I'd be worried.
I would just like to abuse my privilege as moderator, just to say that, to build on that, and say that, this is one of the things that the forum does that really, really has been helpful in terms of getting us to where we are now, but also as we go forward, because I think what Randy says is absolutely right. Maintaining attention is tough, and I think the bodies like this help people in government remember that we do need to keep these discussions going. We need to keep the focus on what we can do and not just be responding to crises. So thank you for that. And Stanley?
Well, Randy talked about, in a sense, intellectual resources, keeping the attention focused. I think that's critical, but we also have to worry about traditional resources, dollars. And I think there are challenges at both sides. When I look at now that we have the framework in place with the 2 declarations, do we have the money to back it up? On the New Zealand side, I think, there's real questions about maintaining the capability to project power, to deal with all the different contingencies we've talked to around the world at a time with limits on defense budgets. And on the U.S. side, we're going through the horrors of sequestration, making rational planning all but impossible, and we don't know what's happening the year after it. So, the hope is that just when we've got the right framework for talking and doing, do we have the financial muscle, to back it up.
Carolyn?
Oh, I was just going to make a point, really. I'm a bit of a newcomer to a lot of the core security areas, and obviously the security protection elements of the customs portfolio are very important. But I also think that actually some of the progress that we see in the core security area is building on the relationships that we actually have that are working on a continuous basis. So perhaps we walk away from the garden for a little while, to pursue that analogy a little bit longer, but actually maybe there's other parts of the garden that are still flourishing. And as we continue to work in very important areas around trade or facilitation areas, and work collectively to reduce harms to each other's societies, then I think that that does provide some of the continuity to the relationship. And as I look forward, and I don't actually see a lot of thorns for New Zealand within its relationship in the customs world, because we've got really good intent on both countries' sides to actually improve the management of the borders. And as Alan said, the border is not that geographic outline of New Zealand as an island. It's very much looking at it as a system, looking at the pre-border approvals, what information we can gather in advance, looking at things at the border. But as Alan rightly pointed out, some of the major security breaches that would have occurred if you simply waited until you got to the border. So I think all of us are trying to push the border perimeter out further. And as we go forward, I think that that provides a little bit of a basis for when we get to some of these rocky patches in the core defence areas, that perhaps there's enough to carry us through in that period of challenge.
Great, thank you, Carolyn. General, do you want to
Just
close for
a
us?
short thing, and picking up a point that's already been made, that the issue, I suppose, the challenge for New Zealand is how do we keep interest up in this, because of the different dynamics. Security is not a really big thing in New Zealand. People on the street would not think about a security issue, the traditional security issue on a monthly basis. It's just not there, whereas it is for the US. And so how do we actually maintain relevancy? And so one of my dilemmas is, how do I still create a defence force that is relevant? We have a security arrangement, Five Eyes it's called, the tight five, the United States, UK, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. Someone's got to be the smallest. But in these times of financial constraints, for us it's a real problem. Where the US might have 400 of whatever aircraft or ships or vehicles, a 10% reduction takes it down to 360. For me, I only have one. So if I can't afford, 10% reduction goes from on to off capability in here. And so it's a case of how do we still make it relevant? I often use the analogy that, another one, that these Five Eyes are like a family. UK is the father, the older, used to international relations. US is the mother, does all the work, puts all the resources in there. Australia and Canada are the two rival siblings, similar, the teenagers that are around there. And we're the 5-year-old that the mother and father tell the teenager to go and take New Zealand out to play. On the swing. So it's the issue of, how do I still make it exciting for everyone else that the 4-year-old's got to go as well? And how do we have capabilities? We can't do everything, and so it's, how do we then understand what our true value is in that security environment? And those are conversations that need to be two ways, and quite blunt conversations back to say, you need to be more of this or less of that. This is where we're going.
Great, thank you.
I just have to say that Mom wants everyone to pull their weight in the family.
Let's take a couple of questions. I see we've got two gentlemen right here. Why don't you go first on my right? Yes, you. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Go, okay.
I was going to ask a question, but someone tweeted something I thought it was really important to point out. And I'll pass it to Jack to ask a question after this, because the reason why I'm not going to ask my question, because it was going to add to the analogy, but we've got to the stage now where we've got a family with a 5-year-old on a yacht that's made of thorns in a pool in a garden somewhere in the middle of China.
It's hard to top that.
I'm just wondering if the Chief of the Defence Forces got an English major somewhere in his background or something, because he's really sort of pulled that out. But the theme that I'm a future partner along with Arati, and I've been fortunate enough to be based in DC the last couple of months, and it's a great town. I love the big obelisk amongst many other things. I do want to ask, based on what Randy said, you sort of pulled the rabbit out of the hat. It's essentially the US-New Zealand relationship or partnership is now very much approaching that of allies like Australia and the US have. So I guess in terms of what's next, does that include a full resumption of ANZUS? Because if that is a possibility at some point, you've got geostrategic considerations such as China. Elements within China love to really sort of milk containment arguments and that sort of thing for all it's worth. Australia is very precious about its one-on-one relationship. It really, no, I'm not going to go down that analogy. It really doesn't want a third party in the room. They are very precious about it because they are the little sort of brother of America, so to speak, in many ways. So I'm just very curious to get everyone's take on the panel on, not trying to put anyone on the spot, but, is a resumption of ANZUS at all possible? If not, then has this partnership reached the plateau, and do we just stay there and work on that, or can we resume it fully? Thanks.
Before we go to that, I'd just like to take maybe two more questions if they're out there. Yes, sir, you who stood up before.
My name is Vinny Lohan. I'm one of the future partners from New Zealand as well. Randy, you played a game. I wanted to play one as well. There's 1.4 billion people in this particular country. Shares a border with China. You mentioned its name. I'm going to let you take a guess what it was. It was not mentioned throughout the whole conference. It wasn't mentioned today throughout the whole day. Is there a particular reason for that?
Okay, and then, thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Miss, if you'd stand up, I'm sorry, right over there, yes. To the young lady. Yes, thank you.
Hi, Kusha Thompson, World Bank, previously New Zealand Treasury. Just wanted to pick up on the discussion about the rise of China. I found that really interesting because your point around the changing norms, I think, is one that can play out across a number of spheres: economic development, trade, and of course defence. But I'm interested in getting your take on the role of the New Zealand-US relationship vis-a-vis the non-Chinas in the region: Japan, Korea, India, Indonesia. If you could make some commentary on that, that would be great.
Great, thank you. So who wants to go first? We have Alliance, India, and non-China. Stanley?
Well, let me take a crack at least two of them. I attach no significance to the fact that India wasn't mentioned today. We didn't talk about Russia. We didn't talk about NATO. We didn't talk a whole heck of a lot about ASEAN. We're basically talking about U.S.-New Zealand relations, and that's why it didn't feature. But I think there's plenty that can be said about India or India-U.S. relations in its own right. On ANZUS, I think it's a very interesting question, but I think sometimes one can make things too hard, meaning that I'm not sure it's worth all the fighting that it would take to formally resume the alliance if we have a structure that gives us all the benefits. And I think what we've done with the two declarations, culminating 20 years of policy designed to get us back to normal, is get past the legality of the situation and away from the intellectual traps of the nuclear issue and to get to talk about how do we work together at a practical level. And if we're having annual senior high-level dialogues on the diplomatic level and at the military level and at the OSD level and all across the board on top of a very robust economic relationship, I'm good. That I don't need to go through all the baggage that it would take with allies and the nuclear theoreticians, you know, in every academy all over the country to get there. So I'm really perfectly happy with the situation where we are now. Let's just build on it and make it work.
Good. Thank you. Who wants to go next? John?
I won't build further on that, on the point of the alliance. I think that's a very good exposition on the reality of the relationship now and the challenge of ever moving in the direction that you're describing. So no, I don't think it's on the agenda, and no, I don't think it's necessary for it to be on the agenda for us to develop the relationship to a very positive place. In terms of the non-China Asian countries, the point is this, that New Zealand and the United States work very, very closely in a range of different fora. So if I think about ASEAN and I think about the EAS, for example, we are working very collaboratively with the ASEAN countries, with the United States, with the Russians, with the Chinese, to talk about and to work through a lot of those wider regional issues. We're also, of course, in an environment where we're negotiating TPP. And we've talked about that this morning, and that provides another construct within which we can have those conversations about countries other than China. Of course, we also have extremely long-standing and very rich bilateral relationships, and we have conversations with our United States friends about those relationships consistently. So I think there's a very active dialogue, and I think there's plenty of opportunity for the two of us to work collaboratively on issues that confront others of our friends in the region.
Great. Randy?
Yeah, I sort of ascribe to the view, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. I stole that too. That's
Alice in Wonderland.
Alice in Wonderland. And I think sort of the notion that we carried when we started some of these initiatives is that we want to move towards an alliance in everything but name and legal terms, which I think is consistent with what you were saying, getting all the benefits, all the activities. But you know, maybe if you do that and you have an alliance in everything but name and in legality, then at some point somebody may say, well, why not flip the switch? But it doesn't have to be on the agenda now. We can have that as sort of the road we're on and move in that direction, and we'll leave it to the future partners to say, why not flip the switch when it makes sense. On just a real quick point on Mongolia you were talking about, 1.4 billion people? No, no. On India, I think there is an opportunity here, but as in all these questions, it takes multiple parties to sort of embrace a particular vision. And I always point out, you know, India's had this look east policy for quite some time now, but it's a look east policy, not a do east policy. And as far as I can tell, there's still a lot of looking and not as much doing. And it's really, I think, to our benefit. The United States, I would not want to speak for our friends in New Zealand, but I would suspect New Zealand's interests, others' interests, to leverage that look east policy and make it more of a do east policy and get involved in the regional architecture, get involved in the activities. I think we'll all benefit from it. But look, I think what's been holding things back has been mostly in Delhi, not elsewhere.
Can I just make one very quick comment, just picking up a comment that Randy's made? Part of the value proposition for New Zealand to the United States is that we are independent and that we can have a different perspective, and we do have different types of relationships with many of the countries in our region. So, I mean, from my point of view, the richness in the relationship and the opportunities in the relationship will often come from our different experience within the region that is a reflection of our independent foreign policy position. So I think I'm really comfortable at the moment. We've got the Wellington Declaration and the Washington Declaration, we've got really good momentum, and we've got the opportunity to express difference into the relationship as required.
I just had just one pointer. It sort of touches on all of these questions, but and what John just said, the value is you have a relationship, for example, with China or with the other countries in Southeast Asia that is different than ours, and that is actually hugely valuable to us. That is, you, for example, can do things military to military with China that we might still be having trouble doing, although we are actively pursuing more military to military engagement with China. Sometimes they're a little more reluctant. India has historically been more reluctant, but all of us working together through things, for example, like ASEAN, where India has now partnered with Vietnam to do one of the executive working groups for the ADMM, the Defense Ministers Forum. That's sort of a first step that I think we strongly welcome, and it shows how this working with the other countries in the region actually helps bridge some of those gaps, helps make things possible that weren't otherwise possible. So, I mean, I think unique in the U.S. government that I sort of cover, what were we saying earlier, Bollywood to Wellywood? I go India to New Zealand, and so I actually get to see a lot of this on a day-to-day basis in all of my work. And I actually think we're at the cusp of something that goes to being more an Indo-Pacific. That construct, I think, actually does have some meat that will start to appear over the next 5 to 10 years. So I think and on that front, I think it's a very interesting time to think about India all the way over to the Pacific, to include the U.S. as a part of that overall construct.
Anybody? Let me ask a couple more questions, and I think we'll probably have to wrap it up. Bill, are we okay? Okay. Yes.
Yes, Peter Townsend from New Zealand. Can I just ask, I think New Zealand was described at some stage during the forum as a stable force in the Pacific, but we've just heard that we have very limited resources. Can you perhaps tell me how the US would play its part in terms of resource provision to assist New Zealand play its role in terms of stability in the Pacific?
Okay, let's see if maybe, are there any more? It's hard to see towards the back. We've got one here.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Rahul Mehta, also a future partner from New Zealand. I just had a question on cybersecurity. And we keep hearing that cybersecurity is going to be the biggest next threat. What active steps are being taken, and what joint collaboration is there between the two countries in this area?
Great, thank you. Okay, so who wants to go first? General?
Yep, if I can talk to Peter's first, the biggest, well, most of the security issues in the Pacific are the new security, the human security, the stability, the economic viability of those countries in the region. And so they're not really the military security, traditional security threats. But there are, and so where the responses need to be made are, first of all, policies that allow countries to govern, to control their wealth and to benefit from it. And yesterday we talked about some of the tuna accords and agreements that were going on. Our part, the US Coast Guard part, Australia, French, responsibility and coordination in that region is to assist those countries that don't have inherent capabilities, or to support the capabilities that they have, but in particular the intelligence flow, which allows us to then monitor what's going on, pass information in a prosecutable stage so that Samoa can deal with issues of illegal fishing or smuggling or things in that particular region. So there is a very tight relationship with particularly the four countries, the quadrilateral group, to support the Pacific Island community. So that's the issue. The biggest challenge, though, is the sheer distance and response time if something physical occurs, like a natural disaster. And that's where the weight does fall again on those same four partners. New Zealand right in the middle as a Pacific country. The French work very well with us and integrated for us, but it's that intelligence flow linkage and the mass that American military and Coast Guard can bring to that particular problem. Cyber issues, what we're doing, again, the linkage or the understanding by all countries in the world, but particularly the countries that have traditionally worked in that security environment have built up those links. It's very strong, and the thing for New Zealand is that we have to be seen as, so we have to in reality not be the weak link. As the latest people to join a security environment, but also the renewed our place in the economic powerhouse of the Asia Pacific. It's important that we actually are robust, that we actually can be seen as being trusted, secure, particular environment. And as been discussed here, the vast majority of cyber attacks are for economic gain, not necessarily security gain. The vast majority of cyber attacks can be prevented by standard commercial off-the-shelf IT protection systems. But there needs to be, I suppose, someone in government agencies that does raise awareness of them, because I think there is still, well, the greatest vulnerability is apathy or lack of knowledge. I'm only a small company, am I going to really be a target? But it's that awareness that needs to be going on. So yeah, the linkages are there, but as has been well described, we are in that early phase of how do you deal with this? What are legitimate responses to it? How do we track that down? But fortunately, we've got the linkages where, as a small country, we can share our lessons, gain lessons from others, and put things into practice that are standardised and give others surety that our information assurance or our protection layers are very good.
Carolyn?
So New Zealand is working in the South Pacific around improving border management systems, and so we have a piece of work underway which is funded by NZ Aid, and that's focused specifically on the Cook Islands, and we're helping improve both the systems and the capability of the people to manage the borders securely in the South Pacific. So once again, that's about strengthening the region, and it's also about protecting, in some ways, some of the backdoor areas that gain access through to the New Zealand's markets as well.
Randy?
Well, I can't help myself on the cyber question, so I'll just make a comment on that. There are technical approaches to this challenge that we would benefit from collaboration, cooperation, best practices, and I think all of that is engaged. All of that is underway and we're engaged on. There are political elements of this, and here's where maybe the division of labor and the difference in the quality of the relationship can come in handy. We're launching a dialogue with China under the auspices of a strategic and economic dialogue to talk about cyber. It's better to talk than not talk, but I'm not terribly optimistic given what we've heard from the Chinese in a range of our ongoing bilateral discussions on cyber. China needs to understand that this activity has an extremely corrosive effect on the relationship, particularly in the United States, on one of the core constituencies that's traditionally been an advocate for the relationship, which is our business community. And to say, we're victims too, we can't really tell through cyber forensics where this stuff is coming from, is not going to be acceptable. There's a new movie out, Zero Dark 30, where they go around the table and they say, how confident are you that Osama bin Laden's in that building? And the protagonist says, well, I'm 98% confident. Actually, I know it would make you really nervous if I said 100%, so I say 98%, but it's really 100%. We are 98% sure that these attacks are coming from particular buildings and facilities in China because we have both the cyber forensics and the open source research and everything that would corroborate this. This has to be dealt with through political and diplomatic channels, and I'm unfortunately not very optimistic that we'll be very effective, but perhaps our friends in New Zealand can assist on this.
Anyone else? Well, I think that we're coming to the end of the session. We've gone a little bit over thanks to Bill's generosity. I want to thank all the panelists and ask you to join me in giving them a round of applause. I want to thank all of you for your excellent questions. Thank you very much.
That was about the most worthwhile hour and a half I think I've spent in the last year. Thank you. Thank you all again.